Welcome to the deep dive. We take the information you're curious about and really dig into it, pulling out what's most important for you to know.
Yeah, get right to the heart of it.
Exactly. And today, we've got a study that, honestly, many of you just getting into bow hunting have asked about. Dr. Ed Ashby's 2005 study, Update GJ Part 6, Trends, Tendencies, FAQs, and Comments.
It's a hefty one, but full of really valuable stuff.
Right. So our goal here is to, cut through the data and figure out what Dr. Ashby's pretty extensive testing on big game tells us about how arrows actually penetrate.
And more importantly, how you can use that information.
Yes, how you can use it to set up your bow and make smarter choices out in the field. We'll be looking closely at how different broadheads perform, mechanicals, modulars, rigid designs.
And how things like impact energy, momentum, and just plain old arrow weight factor in. Plus the damage rates he saw, which is interesting too.
Definitely. Okay, let's dive in.
So right away, if we look at the average penetration from the bulk of Dr. Ashby's buffalo test shots, leaving aside some really specific focal studies, there's a clear pattern.
Okay, what's the pattern?
Based on the broadhead type, rigid broadheads on average penetrated deeper, about 24% more than the modular ones.
22%.
And, get this, a significant 56% deeper than the mechanical broadheads.
Wow, 56. That's a pretty big difference. And what's really surprising, or what seems surprising maybe, is that the mechanicals actually had more energy, right?
Way more. A whopping 46% greater impact kinetic energy compared to the rigid heads.
46% more energy, but 56% less penetration.
Exactly. And the modular broadheads, they had 30% more energy too, but still penetrated less than the rigids.
Huh. So it kind of goes against that initial thought, more energy equals deeper arrow.
It absolutely does, and it gets even more interesting when you look at momentum.
Okay, tell me about momentum.
The average impact momentum was actually very similar across all three types: mechanical, modular, rigid. They were all hovering right around 0.46 to 0.49 slug feet per second.
Really? So similar momentum, but vastly different energy and penetration.
Precisely. Which strongly suggests right from the start that kinetic energy by itself, probably not the most reliable indicator of penetration potential.
Okay, that's a huge point for beginners right there. Don't just chase the highest KE number.
Definitely not. Now, when these arrows hit bone, specifically the scapula, the shoulder blade things got interesting too.
How so? Did they react differently?
Yeah, it seemed like the different types had different experiences. Ashby noted that mechanical broadheads seemed to glance off or maybe avoid hitting the scapula more easily.
Okay.
Only about 9.5% of those shots actually impacted the scapula.
Compared to the others.
Well, for modular broadheads, that number went up to about 16.7%.
Right.
And the rigid broadheads, they had the highest rate of scapular hits, around 19.5%. So they seem to encounter it more often, or maybe engage it more directly.
So the rigids had the roughest ride, so to speak, hitting the hard stuff more often.
You could say that, but, that difference in how often they hit the scapula is one thing. To really compare penetration based purely on the broadhead design, it helps to look at shots that hit a rib first without hitting the scapula.
Right. Isolate that variable. So looking just at those entrance side rib hits, what did he find? Let's start with mechanicals.
Okay, for the mechanical broadheads that hit a rib first, 100% of those shots were basically ideal scenarios.
Ideal how?
Broadside animal, arrow hitting pretty much perfectly perpendicular, 90 degrees, the easiest angle.
Gotcha. Okay, and the modular broadheads hitting ribs.
That was a bit more of a mix. About 58% were broadside perpendicular impact.
And the rest?
The other 42% or so were quartering away shots at an angle around 20 degrees. Still generally considered a pretty good shot angle, but not perfectly broadside.
Okay, so a little more angled. What about the rigid multi-blade heads on rib hits?
They were mostly broadside too, around 82%.
Mostly, okay.
But they also saw some shots that were quartering away more sharply, like at 45 degrees, that was about 11% of them, and then another 7% or so at that 20-degree angle.
So they definitely encountered more varied angles than the mechanicals did when hitting ribs.
For sure. And finally, the rigid single-blade broadheads, they saw the widest range of angles on those rib impacts.
How wide?
While about 78% were broadside.
Still a majority.
Right, but they also had shots quartering away at 45 degrees, that was around 10%, another 9% or so at 20 degrees, and even a few, just over 3%, at a pretty sharp 15-degree angle.
Okay, so they were tested against the toughest angles on those rib hits. Across all these different scenarios, and scapula hits, rib hits, different angles, what's the main takeaway about broadhead performance, especially when bone gets involved?
The really consistent finding, the thing Dr. Ashby keeps emphasizing, is that rigid single-blade broadheads consistently gave the best penetration when they hit heavy bone.
Regardless of the angle.
Regardless of the angle, yeah. Or how the broadhead actually struck the bone. They just powered through better.
So for someone new, hearing that, it sounds like if you're hunting bigger game, or just worried about hitting bone, which can always happen,
Right.
a good, rigid, single-blade design might offer a real advantage in getting that arrow deep enough.
That's definitely what the data suggests. It offers a kind of performance edge in those tough situations.
Now, Dr. Ashby also looked at how often the broadheads themselves got damaged during all this testing.
He did, yeah. And he says some interesting parallels to his earlier Natal study.
Even though that was on different animals, right?
Okay.
Like tougher than deer, but not huge buffalo.
Exactly. So you can't make direct one-to-one comparisons, but the trends are still kind of informative. In this buffalo testing, the modular broadheads had a 60% damage rate.
60%, that's pretty high.
It is. And in the natal study, it was actually quite similar, around 64%, so consistent vulnerability there, perhaps.
And the rigid broadheads in the buffalo test.
Much lower damage rate, only about 16.5%.
Big difference. Now, in the natal study, didn't he break down the rigid heads further?
He did, into single-blade and multi-blade rigids. In that earlier study, the rigid single blades had a very low damage rate, only 15%.
Almost identical to the overall rigid rate in the buffalo study.
Very close, yeah. But the rigid multi-blade heads in the natal study, they showed a much higher damage rate, 50%.
Half of them getting damaged. Wow.
Yeah. It is worth noting, though, that the rigid multi-blades used in this buffalo testing were specifically picked because they'd either done well before or came highly recommended. So maybe a better selection than the average rigid multi-blade from the earlier study.
Okay, that's good context. Let's shift gears a bit now and talk about the underlying physics. Kinetic energy, momentum, and arrow weight. Dr. Ashby really stresses that understanding these is fundamental.
Absolutely. You need to grasp these concepts to really understand arrow penetration and lethality. And this study just reinforces what he's found before.
Which is
that there isn't a clear, predictable link between how much kinetic energy an arrow has at impact and how deep it penetrates. It seems logical, but the data doesn't really support it strongly.
Not even across these hundreds of shots.
Nope. Across these 364 buffalo shots, where the kinetic energy ranged all the way from 23 up to 94 foot-pounds.
That's a huge range.
Massive range. And the correlation between that energy number and the penetration depth, he basically describes it as random.
Random. That's a really strong word. So the big message here for beginners is, don't just look at that KE number on the box or from a calculator and assume higher automatically means better penetration in the real world.
Exactly that. It's just not a reliable predictor on its own when comparing different arrow setups.
So what is he looking for then?
Well, he mentions that a key goal of this ongoing research is trying to figure out the minimum levels of impact force needed for reliable penetration, especially through bone.
Okay.
And interestingly, he notes that all the testing they'd done with heavier arrows, the kind that tend to penetrate well, hadn't actually exceeded 60 foot-pounds of kinetic energy at that point.
So the high penetration wasn't necessarily coming from super high KE levels in those tests.
Not necessarily, no. He also breaks down the average momentum and the average arrow weight for different kinetic energy groups, which is really revealing.
Okay, let's walk through that. The lowest group, arrows under 40 foot-pounds of KE.
Right. That group had an average momentum of 0.48 slug feet per second, and the arrows themselves weighed, on average, around 794 grains. Pretty hefty arrows.
That's 794 grains, yeah. Okay, the next group, 40 to 60 foot-pounds.
Momentum was a little higher, 0.52 on average, and the average weight was similar, around 800 grains. Still heavy arrows.
Okay, seems logical so far. Higher energy, slightly higher momentum, similar weight.
But here's where it gets weird. The next group, 60 to 80 foot-pounds of kinetic energy.
Yeah.
Their average momentum actually dropped slightly down to 0.51, but look at the weight. The average arrow weight plummeted to only 483 grains.
Whoa, from 800 down to under 500. That's a massive drop.
Huge drop. And then the highest energy group, 80 to 100 foot-pounds.
Let me guess, even lighter.
You got it. Momentum went up a bit to 0.57, but the average arrow weight was the lowest of all, just 431 grains.
So the arrows with the most kinetic energy were actually by far the lightest arrows. That feels really counterintuitive if you're just thinking about power.
It totally does. But here's the kicker, the really crucial point Dr. Ashby makes.
Okay.
Those arrows in the 60 to 80 foot-pound group, Remember, they had more kinetic energy than the under 40 group and basically the same momentum.
Right, higher energy, similar momentum, but much lighter arrows.
They actually penetrated, on average, about 12% less.
Less penetration with significantly more kinetic energy.
12% less. That just hammers home the point that kinetic energy isn't telling the whole story about penetration.
Wow. Okay, what about the highest energy group? The 80 to 100 foot-pounders. The lightest arrows with the most KE.
It gets even more dramatic there. They had more than double the kinetic energy of the lowest group
Double.
and about 16% more momentum. But how much better did they penetrate?
I'm guessing not much, based on where this is going.
Barely. Only about 1.7% better penetration on average than the lowest energy group.
1.7%. That's practically nothing for all that extra energy and even a bump in momentum.
Exactly. It's a tiny, almost negligible improvement. So what explains this apparent paradox? Why isn't high KE translating to deep penetration?
Yeah, what's the mechanism here?
It really comes down to arrow weight and how it contributes to momentum and, crucially, the duration of force application.
Okay, unpack that a bit.
Dr. Ashby explains that those super light arrows, the ones in the highest KE group, even though they're moving incredibly fast.
High velocity gives high KE.
Right, but they don't have much mass behind them. Less mass means that even with high speed, the force they deliver upon impact is applied for a much shorter amount of time.
Like a quick slap versus a sustained push.
That's a great analogy. He calls it the time of impulse. A heavier arrow, even if it's moving slower but has good momentum, keeps pushing for longer. And that sustained push is way more effective at getting through tough stuff like hide, muscle, and bone.
Okay, that makes physical sense. It's not just about the peak force, but how long that force acts.
Precisely. Dr. Ashby states it very clearly. Arrow weight, primarily through its contribution to momentum, is the key factor determining how long force is applied to the tissues during penetration.
And across all these buffalo shots, this time factor was really evident.
Absolutely. It's the underlying reason why lightweight, high KE arrows often underperform heavier, moderate KE arrows in terms of penetration on big game.
So we've established KE isn't a great predictor on its own. What about momentum? You said momentum was similar across the board earlier, but is there any correlation between momentum and penetration if you look closer?
Yes, there is. When they looked at the impact momentum across all the shots, grouping them into small increments and then averaged the penetration for each little group, they found a definite positive trend. Generally speaking, arrows with higher impact momentum did tend to penetrate deeper.
Okay, so momentum shows a better relationship than KE.
It does show a positive correlation, yes. It's important to remember, though, that when Ashby is comparing KE or momentum to penetration in these analyses, he's looking at those factors in isolation. He's not explicitly factoring arrow weight into that specific comparison itself. He analyzes weight's effects separately.
Got it. He mentions the specific graphs 10 and 11, that focus only on arrows that went all the way through the buffalo's chest cavity, a full pass-through. What do those show?
Right. Those graphs are interesting because they look at successful penetration, a complete traversal. They focus on arrows with more traditional FOC, not the extreme forward-weighted ones.
Okay.
Graph 11 compares penetration depth. Well, actually, it just plots the data points for pass-throughs against impact kinetic energy, broken down by arrow mass groups. Graph 10 does the same, but plots against impact momentum.
And what's the takeaway from those?
What's really striking, especially in Graph 11, the KE graph, is how few arrows weighing less than 750 grains actually achieved a full pass-through. Even some with really high kinetic energy levels didn't make it all the way through.
So even high KE didn't guarantee a pass-through for lighter arrows. But Graph 10, the momentum graph.
That one tells a different story. It clearly shows that positive correlation we were just talking about. There's a definite visual trend. As the impact momentum of these heavier arrows increases, the likelihood of achieving full penetration, a pass-through, also clearly increases.
So momentum tracks much better with achieving that ultimate goal of a pass-through.
It appears to, yes, especially with these heavier arrows that are generally better suited for it anyway.
Did he compare the different weight groups within that momentum graph, Graph 10?
He did. He compared the arrows weighing between 750 and 900 grains with those weighing over 900 grains. These groups had a similar number of shots in them.
Okay.
And he found that about a 12.5% increase in average impact momentum between those two groups resulted in a very similar, almost one-to-one, 13.5% increase in penetration depth needed for the pass-through.
Wow, that's a really close correlation.
Very close. And then he did another comparison. He combined the few lighter arrows, under 750 grains, that did pass through with the 750, 900 grain group. They happen to have the same average momentum.
Right.
And compared that combined group to the heaviest arrows, the over 900 grain group. Again, strong correlation. About an 11% increase in penetration for a 12.5% increase in momentum.
So consistently, for arrows heavy enough to pass through, more momentum pretty directly leads to more penetration.
That's what this specific data subset suggests. He explains that this strong correlation seen in these pass-through arrows is likely because they shared other beneficial traits too.
Like what?
Things like just having high overall weight using effective broadheads, having an arrow shaft that's slightly narrower than the broadhead furrow, which reduces friction, and just good, stable arrow flight. All factors that aid penetration.
So when you have arrows that are already well built for penetration, momentum becomes a really clear driver.
Exactly. But he also makes a really important point about the overall data, not just the pass-throughs. Even when you lump all the shots together with all the different broadheads, shaft materials, energy levels, even including shots where the broadhead was damaged.
Right. All the messy, real-world variables.
That general positive trend between higher impact momentum and better penetration still holds up. Averaging smooths out the noise, but the underlying positive relationship remains visible.
That's powerful. Even with all that variability, momentum still matters.
It really seems to. And he clarifies that when the external dimensions of the arrows are similar, like they were for many in graph 10, the strength of that momentum penetration link boils down once again to that time component of the impulsive force.
Back to the duration of the push.
Exactly. Assuming similar force and resistance, it's how much the arrow's weight contributes to its momentum that dictates how long that force gets applied. Heavy arrow skills on longer push.
He also looked briefly at some arrows with extreme forward-to-center balance, right? Graphs 12 and 13.
Yeah, a smaller data set for those, but he notes they showed the same general trends.
Which were?
No obvious correlation between kinetic energy and penetration, but a clear positive correlation between impact momentum and penetration. Same pattern, different arrow style.
Okay, so let's really try to boil this down. What's the absolute key takeaway regarding kinetic energy that a novice bow hunter needs to understand from all this?
The crucial thing, and Dr. Ashby highlights this specifically, is that you'll only really see a clear correlation between higher kinetic energy and better penetration when you are considering a single specific arrow setup.
Ah, okay, so if I take my arrow and I shoot it faster.
Right. If you increase the velocity of that one arrow to get more kinetic energy, you are also, by definition, increasing its momentum, because momentum is mass times velocity.
Okay, that makes sense. More speed equals more KE and more momentum for the same arrow.
But, and this is the really critical part, the increase in penetration you get is not proportional to the increase in kinetic energy. There's a point of diminishing returns, meaning you get less and less additional penetration for each extra bit of kinetic energy you add by increasing velocity. He calls it a decrement. The rate of penetration gain slows down as KE goes up for that single arrow.
Got it. So even for one arrow, just cranking up the speed for more KE isn't necessarily the most efficient way to boost penetration beyond a certain point.
That seems to be the implication. Momentum, driven significantly by weight, appears to be a more consistent factor overall.
Okay, that distinction is super important for beginners choosing equipment. Now, Dr. Ashby includes a really helpful section of frequently asked questions. I think going through these will clear up a lot for our listeners.
Yeah, these are great. He tackles some common points directly.
First off, funding. It's always good to know if there's any potential bias. How is this research paid for?
Dr. Ashby is very clear on this. It's entirely self-funded. As of the time of this report, 2005, he'd personally put in over $300,000. That includes his work on the earlier Nadal study, too. He explicitly states he has zero financial ties to the archery industry, doesn't make or sell gear, doesn't take money or sponsorships from anyone in the business.
That's a huge personal investment and really underlines the objectivity. He's doing it purely for the knowledge.
It certainly seems that way. It lends a lot of credibility to the findings.
Oh, okay. Next question. Why spend so much time and effort digging into kinetic energy versus momentum? Why does that relationship matter so much?
He explains it's vital for a couple of reasons. First, for us as bow hunters, to make informed choices about arrow lethality. Second, it's crucial for educating people outside of bow hunting, like government agencies that might regulate the sport.
Because they might base regulations on flawed assumptions.
Exactly. He points out there's way less data on hunting arrow performance compared to firearms data. And his research consistently shows that kinetic energy, as it's usually defined and measured, is not a valid predictor of penetration or lethality across different setups.
And he says just knowing the bow type or draw weight isn't enough either.
Right. Bow efficiency varies wildly. He gives a great example. An old-style longbow shooting a heavy arrow could actually generate more momentum than a modern high-draw-weight compound shooting a very light arrow.
That really drives home why you can't just look at draw weight.
Absolutely. So he argues that having solid data like this is essential to challenge potentially bad regulations, ones that might restrict effective gear while allowing less effective stuff based on, say, KE minimums alone.
Makes sense. He even hints that newer data, maybe with those extreme FOC arrows, might show lower draw weight bows could perform really well if set up right.
Yeah, potentially achieving similar results to higher draw weight bows using more conventional arrows. It's all about optimizing the system.
Okay, next FAQ. Some people might see his findings and think he's just against certain types of broadheads like replaceable blade, multi-blade, or wide-cut heads. What's his actual position?
He clarifies it's definitely not about being against them. His whole point is about understanding the performance characteristics and, importantly, the limitations of each type.
So it's about informed choice, not just saying one type is bad.
Precisely. For instance, he actually recommends that if a bow hunter struggles to get fixed blades truly razor sharp, they might be better off using a sharp replaceable blade head than a dull fixed blade, even a high-quality one. Sharpness is paramount.
That's practical advice. And for multi-blade heads.
He emphasizes that design quality varies a lot, and users need to be aware that some designs might have limitations regarding the minimum impact force needed for good penetration, or they might not perform as well at steeper angles.
What about wide-cutting diameter broadheads? He actually uses them sometimes himself, right?
He does. For smaller game like turkeys or predators, or situations where getting super deep penetration isn't the absolute top priority, he says wider cuts can be very effective, create a bigger hole.
But not for big animals?
Right. He advises against using them for really large, tough animals like elk, moose, big bears, buffalo, or even large hogs, where maximizing deep penetration is critical to reach vital organs, especially if you hit bone.
Okay, so it's about matching the tool to the job. How does all this benefit the average bow hunter, the person maybe just hunting deer? Does all this focus on buffalo and heavy bone really apply?
Dr. Ashby argues strongly that it absolutely does. The fundamental factors that influence arrow penetration weight, momentum, broad head design, structural integrity are universal. They apply whether you're shooting a deer or a buffalo.
And even deer have bones that can stop an arrow, right?
Definitely. Deer have solid bones like the scapula and the humerus, the upper leg bone, especially on mature animals. Hitting those can easily stop a poorly designed arrow. So, maximizing your arrow's penetration potential is vital even for deer-sized game.
That leads into the next common idea he tackles.
Yeah.
Saying, well, just shoot them in the right place and you don't need all that penetration.
Yeah, the perfect shot argument. He points out very realistically that even the most experienced ethical bow hunters will admit they've made less than perfect shots sometimes.
Hunting isn't target practice.
Exactly. Animals move unexpectedly, there's wind, uneven ground, buck fever. Stuff happens. No one can guarantee a perfect shot every single time.
So the extra penetration is like insurance.
That's exactly how he frames it. When a less than ideal hit inevitably occurs, having an arrow setup designed for maximum penetration can often be the crucial difference between recovering that animal quickly and ethically or losing it.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. What about breaking heavy bone? Can any arrow setup be reliably counted on to bust through, say, a deer's shoulder blade every time?
He says yes, some setups are capable of breaking heavy bones, but emphasizes it's not something that will happen every single time. There are just too many variables, exact angle of impact, specific spot on the bone, arrow flexion, etc.
Like his analogy with rifle bullets sometimes glancing off bone.
Right. Just because it's not 100% guaranteed doesn't mean there's no benefit to using a setup designed to handle bone better. He's very clear he's not advocating deliberately shooting for the shoulder.
That's important.
Very. But he stresses that maximizing penetration significantly increases the frequency of achieving lethal penetration if an accidental heavy bone hit occurs.
And his personal experience backs this up.
He notes that with his own preferred heavier arrow setups, he personally hasn't experienced a failure to penetrate the scapula or humerus on large animals he's hunted. The setup is designed to handle it.
Okay. Now, a question I bet a lot of novices wonder about. Is there a known minimum impact force needed for an arrow to be a reliable bone breaker, specifically on deer-sized game?
Dr. Ashby acknowledges that, at the time of this writing, he doesn't have a precise number for that minimum threshold.
Yeah.
It's something they were still hoping to determine through more testing.
But he knows his setup is above it.
Yes, he's confident his own typical hunting setup performs well above whatever that minimum might be, citing his 100% success rate in achieving lethal penetration, usually pass-throughs, on heavy bone hits on deer-sized animals.
So, while the exact number is unknown, the principle is to be well above the minimum. He also makes the point about the arrow's inherent potential, right? Regardless of the force.
Absolutely. He states clearly that an arrow's penetration potential, basically how well it's designed to penetrate, is a major factor at any given impact force.
Meaning some arrows just aren't built for tough jobs.
Right. He says there are definitely broadhead and arrow combinations out there that simply will not consistently penetrate the shoulder bones of larger deer, even with adequate energy or momentum behind them. They just aren't designed well enough structurally or hydrodynamically.
And these occasional failures are why optimizing matters.
Exactly. Those failures, even if infrequent for some hunters, are precisely why serious, ethical hunters should strive to optimize their arrow setups. He applies everything he's learned to his own arrows and notes he hasn't lost an animal due to terminal arrow failure.
And then he hits us with that really powerful line.
Yeah. No one has ever lost an animal because their arrow penetrated too much, but multitudes have been lost because it penetrated too little. That really sums it up.
It really does. So who benefits most from using these maximum penetration arrow concepts? Is it just for certain niches?
While he acknowledges it's most obviously beneficial for hunters using lighter draw-weight bows on standard big game.
Like youth or women or folks with shoulder issues.
Exactly. And also for anyone hunting very large, tough animals like the ones in his tests. But he argues strongly that it also benefits the quote-unquote average bow hunter using typical equipment for typical game like deer.
How so?
Because maximizing penetration expands the effective capabilities of any setup. It increases the likelihood of pass-through shots, which generally leave better blood trails. And crucially, it provides that vital margin of error, that safety net, for those inevitable, less than perfect hits.
So better performance overall and more forgiveness when things go slightly wrong.
That's the idea.
Okay, another interesting question. Is it better for the arrow to zip through and stick in the dirt? Or should it stop inside the animal, maybe causing more damage by staying in?
Dr. Ashby addresses this by citing medical studies, primarily on human arrow wounds. That research indicates that bleeding, especially significant hemorrhaging, occurs more rapidly when the arrow doesn't remain in the wound.
Really? So leaving it in slows bleeding.
Apparently, yes. An arrow shaft left in place can act like a plug, applying pressure to severed vessels and surrounding tissues, slowing down blood loss. He mentions emergency medical guidelines often advise against removing impaled objects like arrows until the patient is in surgery precisely for this reason.
Huh. I wouldn't have guessed that.
Yeah, and he adds that research on animals suggests tissues can clamp down sideways on an arrow shaft if the animal is moving, further restricting blood flow from the wound channel itself.
So the clear goal for bow hunting should be?
A complete pass-through. 2 holes are better than 1 for bleeding, and you avoid the potential plugging effect.
Gotcha. Okay, last FAQ. Blood trails. What determines how good a blood trail is?
It's a combination of factors, really. Where the entrance and exit wounds are located is huge. Low exit wounds obviously tend to bleed out better. Which organs are hit plays a massive role, and potentially whether the arrow stays in or passes through might also be a factor, based on what we just discussed.
Does the broadhead itself matter? Like number of blades or cutting width?
Interestingly, he mentions that their initial studies hadn't found a direct correlation between the broadhead's cut area, volume, or number of blades and the quality of the blood trail. However, he notes that ongoing research was looking more into the role of the arrow shaft remaining in the wound. So, still some unknowns there.
Okay, we've covered a ton of really practical questions there. Now, let's get to Dr. Ashby's final comments section, which sort of distills his philosophy based on all this testing.
Yeah, these are his big picture takeaways, really valuable for anyone, but especially novices trying to form their approach.
What's the first point he makes?
He starts with an analogy to the old days of rifle hunting in Africa, where the rule was often use enough gun. meaning you were expected to carry a rifle capable of handling the largest potential game you might encounter on that hunt, even if you were primarily after smaller stuff.
Okay, be prepared for the worst case or biggest case scenario.
Exactly. His point is the same principle applies directly to bow hunting. Always be prepared with equipment specifically, an arrow that is adequate for effectively and ethically taking down anything you might realistically encounter in the area you're hunting.
Don't be undergunned or under-arrowed, so to speak.
Precisely. He also really stresses making informed decisions about every single component of your arrow setup.
Considering what factors?
Things like the specific game you're targeting, how efficient your particular bow is, and the likely conditions you'll face, shot distances, potential angles, etc.
And understanding your setup helps you make better shot decisions.
Yes, he emphasizes that having a realistic understanding of what your arrow is likely capable of doing on a given animal at a given range and angle helps you make more responsible choices about whether or not to even take the shot in the first place. Knowing your limitations is key.
That's really important ethical advice. And what's his ultimate sort of final piece of guidance?
He circles back to that Robert Ruart quote, "Use enough gun," and translates it directly, "Use enough arrow."
Simple, but powerful.
Very. And he states unequivocally that the arrow itself is far, far more critical for achieving good penetration than the bow is. The bow provides the launch energy, but the arrow does the work upon arrival.
And unlike the weather or the animal's movement, your arrow choice is something you totally control.
That's his key point. It's one of the few variables in hunting where you have absolute control, so choose wisely. His final recommendation is basically, always use gear adequate for the biggest thing you might shoot. Understand your gear's limits, and remember,
Let me guess.
there's no downside to too much penetration, but too little can be absolutely devastating.
Man, that really brings it all together. Okay, so summarizing the absolute must-knows for a novice bow hunter from this deep dive into Ashby's work.
Number 1, focus on arrow weight and how it contributes to momentum. That seems to be a much more reliable driver of penetration, especially through tough stuff, than just chasing high kinetic energy numbers.
Right. KE alone is misleading when comparing different arrows.
Exactly. Number 2, understand that different broadhead types perform differently, particularly when bone is involved. The data here strongly suggests rigid single-blade designs offer superior bone-penetrating capabilities.
Doesn't mean other types won't work, but rigids seem more reliable for tough hits.
That's what the tests indicate, yeah. So number 3, choose an arrow setup that maximizes your potential for penetration for this specific game you're hunting. Don't skimp here.
Because that provides the crucial safety margin, right, for when things don't go perfectly.
Precisely. It's about building in forgiveness for those less than ideal shots that are, frankly, a part of real-world hunting. It increases your odds of a quick, ethical recovery.
So, thinking about all these insights from Dr. Ashby's study, maybe a good question for everyone listening, especially if you're newer to this, is what adjustments might you consider for your own arrow setup to enhance its penetration potential and maybe boost your overall confidence in the field?
That's a great question to ponder. It's all about making informed choices.
Definitely something to think about. And as always, if you have other sources, studies, articles, whatever, that you'd like us to dig into in a future deep dive, please send them our way. We love getting those suggestions.
Yeah, keep them coming.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.